Story 1. The Man in the Kudzu Vines. It was late enough in the evening that the road had gone black, except for the stretch of it my headlights touched. I'd taken the back way to avoid a washed-out bridge near the highway, and that meant passing through Paint Creek's forgotten end, the kind of road where mailboxes leaned at odd angles and kudzu swallowed everything in reach. The air smelled like wet leaves and rusted metal, the kind of damp that sinks into your clothes and lingers. I remember rolling the window down a crack for some air, only to regret it immediately. The smell of earth, heavy and raw, came flooding in, and underneath it was something sharper, almost sour. I was easing around a bend when the beams from my headlights caught movement in the tangle of green to my right. Kudzu had climbed over the fence there years ago, layering itself so thick it looked like a frozen wave of leaves. Something was caught in it. At first I thought it was a deer, maybe snagged in barbed wire hidden beneath the vines. But when it shifted, slow and deliberate, the shape was wrong. Long, thin shoulders, an arm that hung too low, and then the head turned toward me, and every part of me knew I wasn't looking at an animal. The face was narrow, skin stretched too tight across the bones, streaked with dirt like it had been sleeping in the ground. The eyes caught the light, shining wet in the dark, and they didn't blink, not once. He just stood there, the vines curling around his ribs like they'd grown up with him in them. I don't know how long we stared at each other. It could have been seconds, but it felt longer. My foot stayed on the brake, the car idling, my hand tightening on the wheel until it hurt. Then, something about the stillness broke me. I pressed the gas, coasting forward, trying not to look in the mirror. The road seemed longer than it should have been, the air inside the car thick. I thought about pulling over to call someone, but the thought of stopping felt worse than keeping on. My mind kept replaying the face, the vines, the way the leaves had moved like they were breathing around him. A mile later, I rounded another bend and saw them. Fresh, muddy footprints right in the center of the road. Bare feet, each one pressed deep, toes spread like they'd gripped the dirt. They were wet enough to glisten in the low beam. My chest tightened. The last turn I'd taken had been nothing but blacktop and forest on both sides. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I kept driving. I didn't even slow down to look closer. The smell inside the car was stronger now. Wet earth, rotting leaves, and something else I couldn't place. My window was up, the vents blowing air that shouldn't have carried any smell at all. By the time I saw the faint glow of town ahead, my hands were shaking. I pulled into a gas station under the hum of the fluorescent lights and just sat there until my breathing calmed. When I finally stepped out, the night air smelled normal again, like asphalt and diesel. But when I opened my trunk to grab my jacket, I froze. The rubber seal along the inside of the trunk was caked with streaks of fresh mud. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about those eyes in the kudzu, unblinking, and the way the footprints had been ahead of me. Over the next week, I convinced myself it was a drifter, someone living off the land in the old places people forgot about. That made sense, and I clung to it. A few days later, though, I was driving home from work and passed the same stretch of road. The vines were still there, thick and heavy, but something about the shape of them stopped me. I slowed down just enough to see that part of the kudzu looked torn, the leaves ripped down to the stems in long, vertical strips, and hanging on one vine, swaying gently in the breeze, was a strip of what looked like fabric, brown, damp, and fraying. I didn't stop. I didn't want to know. Weeks went by without incident, but sometimes, late at night, I'd get the urge to check my locks twice, even 3 times. I started keeping the curtains closed. One morning, walking out to my car, I noticed a faint trail of muddy footprints across my driveway, leading up from the road and stopping just short of my front porch. They were small this time, narrower, but the same bare spread of toes. I stopped taking the back way altogether. Still, the smell found me now and then. Inside the house, in my car, even at work. Always faint, but enough to pull me back to that moment on the road. I never saw him again, not in the flesh, but there were nights when I'd wake up certain I wasn't alone. Once, I swore I heard the sound of leaves shifting against glass, slow and deliberate. You tell yourself things like that are in your head, that shadows move and houses creak. But there's something about Appalachia's forgotten places, those hollows and back roads, that feels like they're still claimed by someone, even if no one lives there anymore. Someone who knows every step you take. Someone who waits. And every time I pass a wall of kudzu now, I look straight ahead, never to the side. Because if I see those eyes again, I don't know if I'll have the sense to keep driving. Story 2, Knocking from the Root Cellar. I got the call about Aunt Louise in late October, the kind of grey day where the clouds hang low enough to feel like they're pressing the hills into the earth. She'd been gone for 3 days before anyone found her. I hadn't been back to that little Appalachian town in years, but she didn't have kids, and my mother had passed before her, so the house fell to me. It wasn't much. White paint peeled down to the bare boards, porch sagging like it was tired of holding on, but it sat on a piece of land with an apple orchard gone wild behind it, and beyond that, a sloping yard that ran into a line of skeletal trees. I drove in with the last of the daylight and the first bite of winter in the air. The place hadn't been lived in for years before she died. She'd been staying with a friend after a fall last winter and never came back. Inside, it smelled of dust and rainwater, with a faint edge of something sweet gone bad. I walked through each room, flicking on the dim lamps, finding small things I remembered from childhood visits. Her jar of buttons, the faded photo of her and my mother on the porch steps, a chipped mug with violets painted on it. Out back, the yard dipped to a low spot where the root cellar sat, half sunk into the earth. I remembered playing around it as a kid, daring my cousins to open the heavy door and go down into the cool, dirt-dark air. The wooden hatch was weathered grey, metal hinges swollen with rust. I didn't even bother checking inside that first evening. The idea of stepping into that stale underground space after all these years felt wrong. That night, the wind came up strong, rattling through the cracks in the old windows. I lay in the bed in the front room, half asleep, listening to the house creak and settle. Sometime past midnight, I heard it, a low, hollow knock. 3 slow thumps, a pause, then 3 more. I sat up, thinking maybe it was a loose shutter hitting the siding. I lay back down. It came again. The sound was coming from out back, and I realized with a cold twist in my gut that it was coming from the direction of the root cellar. I told myself it was just something shifting in the wind, maybe a branch hitting the door. I didn't go out to check until morning. When I walked down to the cellar, the frost-crusted grass crunching under my boots, I saw them, muddy handprints smeared across the inside of the small, square window in the cellar door. The glass was cloudy, the prints streaked like something had slid its fingers downward. The door was still closed, the padlock still in place, but the sight of those prints made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. That afternoon, I found some old nails and a hammer in the shed and drove them in across the doorframe. I told myself it was to keep animals out. That night, I tried not to listen for the knocking, but it came anyway. 3 slow knocks, pause, 3 more. Only this time, the sound was sharper, like whatever was on the other side was closer to the surface of the door. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds between knocks. Around 3 a.m., they stopped. I drifted off just before dawn, only to wake to the sound of crows in the orchard. When I stepped outside, my stomach turned over. The nails I'd driven into the door were bent outward, their points sticking toward me. I didn't have an explanation that fit. I considered packing up and leaving, but something about the house felt like it was holding me there. I told myself I'd open the cellar in daylight, see what was inside, and put the whole thing to rest. The next afternoon, I pried the nails out and opened the door. The hinges screamed. A damp, cold smell rose up, heavy with earth and mildew. The light from outside didn't reach far. The steps down were slick, the packed dirt walls sweating moisture. I shone my flashlight into the corners, empty shelves, rotting wooden crates, a few broken jars. No sign of anything living. I stayed just long enough to satisfy myself it was empty before backing out and shutting the door. That night, the knocking came again, louder. I stayed in bed, every muscle tensed, until the sound changed. Between the knocks came a slow, dragging noise, like fingertips scraping across wood. I put a pillow over my head, but I could still feel the sound in my bones. The next morning, I noticed something new. The muddy handprints were back, higher this time, as though whoever made them had been standing on the steps inside, pressing closer to the window. I stopped going near the cellar after that. I tried to focus on the rest of the house, fixing a leak in the kitchen sink, oiling the door hinges. But each night, the knocking returned, steady and patient. I started sleeping with a lamp on, as though that thin circle of light could keep the dark away. One night, the knocking didn't stop after 3 sets. It kept going, slow and deliberate, for what felt like hours. At some point, I realized it wasn't coming from the cellar anymore. The sound was in the house. I lay frozen, listening to it move. 3 knocks on the back door, then silence. 3 knocks on the wall near the kitchen. 3 on the hallway outside my room. I didn't open my eyes until morning. When I finally forced myself outside, the cellar door hung open, the padlock and latch broken clean through. The steps down were bare, no footprints, no sign of anything. But the smell was there. That damp earth smell, stronger than before. And it followed me back into the house, clinging to my clothes. I left that afternoon, packed my bag, locked the house, and drove until the hills gave way to flat land. I told myself I'd come back in the spring, maybe sell the place, but weeks turned into months, and I never did. Still, sometimes at night, in whatever apartment I've rented since, I'll wake to the sound of 3 slow knocks, a pause, then 3 more. And even in the middle of the city, far from those hills. Story 3. The Silent Watchers, by the tracks. I grew up in a part of Appalachia where the mountains pressed in on you from all sides, the roads narrow and winding, and the only straight path through was the abandoned rail line that cut between the ridges. The tracks hadn't been used in decades. Most of the rails had been pulled up and sold for scrap, but the gravel bed was still there, a worn path between the trees. It was faster than taking the road home from school, and I'd been using it since I was old enough to walk alone. My mother didn't like me cutting through there, said the Holler folk kept to themselves for a reason, but I was young and didn't think much about it. One afternoon in late autumn, a thick fog had rolled in before the final bell. By the time I reached the old tracks, the world had shrunk down to 30 feet in every direction. The air was wet and still, and my footsteps crunched against the gravel in a way that sounded too loud. I'd just rounded a bend where the tracks cut along a slope, the hillside rising up to my right, when I saw them. 3 figures stood on the slope above me, perfectly still. At first, I thought they were kids from one of the houses higher up the ridge. They were barefoot, their clothes torn and hanging loose. Their skin was dark with soot or maybe dried mud, streaked unevenly like they'd been crawling through something. I called out, more to cut through the strange quiet than anything. My voice sounded small in the fog. None of them moved, they didn't even shift their weight. The stillness was so complete that for a second I thought they might be scarecrows someone had propped up. But then one of them blinked, slow and deliberate, and I realized they were watching me, all 3 of them. Something about it put a weight in my chest. I turned back to the path and walked faster. I didn't hear them follow, but the silence behind me felt heavier than the fog. I didn't look back until I reached the curve where the tracks dropped into the next valley, and when I did, the slope was empty. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they'd gone back into the trees. Maybe they were just curious. But the next afternoon, I found myself glancing at that same slope, expecting to see them again. The fog was gone, sunlight cutting through the bare branches, and the hillside was empty. It was a week later when I saw them again. Same place, same stillness, but this time the sky was overcast and the light was fading fast. They stood exactly as before, barefoot, soot-streaked, eyes fixed on me. I didn't call out this time. I kept walking, trying to ignore the prickling along my neck. I told myself I'd take the road from then on, even if it added 20 minutes to the walk. But habits are hard to break, and a few days later I found myself on the tracks again, the shortcut too tempting. I didn't see them that time, but when I got home, my mother asked why my pant leg was muddy from the knee down. I hadn't noticed it before. I told her I must have brushed against the bank, but the truth was I hadn't stepped off the gravel once. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing shapes in the tree line near that slope. Never clear enough to make out faces, but always there, standing just far enough back that the shadows kept them hidden. They only appeared when I was alone. If a friend walked with me, the slope would be empty. If I rode my bike through, I'd feel eyes on me, but the hillside would be still. One evening, I decided to see how close I could get before they disappeared. I climbed the bank slowly, my hands sinking into the damp earth, the smell of wet leaves filling my nose. Halfway up, I heard a rustle in the brush above me, followed by silence. When I pulled myself over the crest, the clearing was empty, but the ground was marked with small, bare footprints leading into the trees. They were recent, the edges still crisp in the mud. I didn't follow. After that, I avoided the shortcut altogether, even if it meant walking home in the dark. But avoiding it didn't help. I started waking up at night with the feeling that someone was outside my window. The curtains would be drawn, the glass fogged from my own breath, but the sensation was strong enough to keep me awake until morning. Once, in the middle of the night, I got up for water and saw movement in the yard, a quick, flickering shadow near the edge of the trees. When I stepped closer to the window, the motion stopped. In the weak moonlight, I thought I saw 3 shapes standing just beyond the tree line, perfectly still, facing the house. I blinked, and they were gone. I told no one, not my mother, not my friends. I didn't want to hear the explanations they'd come up with. By early winter, the ground was frozen hard, and the days were short. I started to think maybe they were gone, whoever they were. Then, one grey afternoon, I had to take the tracks again. There'd been a wreck on the main road, and the detour cut through the old line. The slope was bare when I passed it, but as I reached the far curve, I glanced back. They were there, all 3, standing at the bottom of the slope now where the gravel met the trees. The distance between us was less than it had ever been. My breath caught, and I forced myself to keep walking, my steps measured. I didn't hear them follow, but the sound of the wind in the bare branches above me felt wrong, like the air was holding its breath. That night, I dreamed of the tracks. I was walking them in the fog, but the gravel crunched too loudly underfoot. When I turned, they were behind me, close enough that I could see the cracks in their skin where the soot had dried and flaked. None of them had pupils, just dark, wet eyes that reflected the weak light like water. I woke before they could reach me, my chest tight and damp with sweat. The next morning, I found muddy prints on the back porch. Small, bare, the toes spread wide. They led to the door and stopped. I never took the tracks again, but sometimes, on cold, still days, I'll catch myself glancing toward the tree line, certain that if I looked long enough, I'd see them standing there, watching, waiting for me to walk that way again. Story 4. The Grocery Store Basement Door. I started working nights at the grocery store in the middle of January, the kind of winter where the snow doesn't fall heavy but lingers in frozen patches along the sidewalks, never melting completely. It was the only store in town, 2 aisles for dry goods, a small produce section, a deli that closed before sundown. My shift started at 9 after the place shut down and ran until 3 in the morning. Most nights it was just me and the hum of the freezers, the distant pop of the old building settling. At the far end of the back room, past the stacks of pallets and boxes, there was a rusted steel door in the wall. It didn't lead outside, it dropped down into the basement. Nobody used it anymore. The manager, a man named Carl who'd worked there longer than anyone, said it had flooded years ago and wasn't worth fixing. I never saw anyone open it, and the only sign it had ever been used were the scuff marks worn into the concrete in front of it. I'd been there maybe 3 weeks when I first heard it. I was breaking down cardboard near the loading dock when a sound floated up from the far end of the room, a shuffling like someone dragging something heavy over the floor. At first I thought it was the wind through one of the cracked windows, but then I heard voices. Faint, low, impossible to make out, but definitely voices. I froze, listening. They came from behind the steel door. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small in the cavernous back room. The voices stopped. I stood there for another 30 seconds waiting for a reply, then convinced myself it was just my imagination. I went back to work, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being listened to. The next night, it happened again. This time it was more distinct. 2 people speaking in low tones, the kind of muffled rhythm that made it clear they were in conversation. I stepped closer, pressing my ear to the door. The steel was cold against my skin. There was a sudden scrape, like something metallic being dragged across the floor below. I jumped back, heart hammering. "Hey!" I called again. "Who's down there?" No answer. I went to find Carl. He was in the office, counting receipts. I told him I thought maybe some kids had broken in through the basement. He just gave me a look I couldn't read and handed me the ring of keys without a word. By the time I got back to the door, it was open. The lock hung loose, swinging slightly. I know for certain I hadn't heard it unlatch. The stairwell beyond was steep, the steps narrow and slick with age. My flashlight beam barely cut the darkness. Halfway down, crouched on the steps, was someone. They were facing me, head tilted low so the top of their hair caught the light first, and then their eyes. 2 small, wet glints that caught my beam like an animal's in the road. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I don't think I breathed. Then, without a sound, the door swung shut between us. The slam echoed through the back room, and I found myself standing there in the quiet, holding the useless ring of keys. I didn't try to open it again that night. The next day, Carl avoided my eyes when I handed him the keys back. He didn't ask what I'd seen. He didn't have to. I think he already knew. After that, the nights changed. The voices became more frequent, sometimes rising just enough that I could swear I heard my own name in them. I stopped going near the door unless I had to, but even from across the room, I'd catch the faint scrape of movement below. One night, I walked into the back to find the door ajar, just an inch, but enough to show the black slit of the stairwell. I told myself I wasn't going to look, but my eyes went there anyway. The darkness at the bottom shifted like it had weight to it. I backed away, box cutter still in hand, my pulse pounding in my ears. 2 weeks later, I came in for my shift to find the air in the back room damp and cold, like the chill of an open root cellar. The door was closed, but a thin line of water had seeped from beneath it, pooling toward the drain. The smell was faint, but sharp, like rust and something sweet turning sour. That night, the voices didn't stop when I walked in. They kept going, even when I stood a few feet from the door. My hand hovered near the handle before I caught myself and stepped back. I didn't need to see them again. The last time I heard them was during a snowstorm in February. The wind outside howled against the windows, but underneath it came the same low murmurs, steady and unhurried. I tried to drown them out with music, but even with my headphones in, I could still feel them under the sound, like a vibration in my chest. Sometime after midnight, the store lights flickered. When they came back, the steel door was standing wide open. The stairwell yawned black, swallowing my flashlight beam before it hit the bottom, and just as I stepped back, something came up the steps. I didn't see it fully, only a shape, low and moving fast, the sound of bare feet slapping against wet wood. I stumbled into the stack of pallets behind me, the crash echoing through the room, and by the time I scrambled to my feet, the door was shut again. I quit the next day, didn't even give notice, just left my key on the counter and walked out into the cold. That was years ago. The store's still there, though I heard they remodeled the back room. I don't know if the door's still there or if they bricked it over. I don't ask, but every so often, if I'm out late walking past the building, I'll hear it, faint and muffled under the hum of the freezers, the slow, patient sound of voices rising from somewhere below, and sometimes I think I catch the scrape of something metallic moving in the dark, just waiting for the lock to fail again. Story 5. Footsteps on the tin roof. It was early spring when my brother and I came back to the family place, the old house sitting halfway up a ridge in the part of Appalachia where the roads turn to dirt before you even realize it. The property had been in our family for close to 100 years, but no one had lived there full time in over a decade. Our plan was simple: clean the place up, make a few repairs, and put it on the market before summer. The drive up took us past swollen creeks and fields just starting to green, but the house itself looked the same as it had when we were kids. Pale paint peeling from the siding, porch sagging under years of neglect, tin roof dulled to a soft grey. The first day was nothing but work. We swept out cobwebs, hauled broken furniture to the shed, and cleared the front path of last year's leaves. By nightfall, our backs ached and our hands were black with dust. A light rain had started by then, and the sound of it on the tin roof was almost comforting, a steady drumming that seemed to wrap the house in a blanket. We both turned in early, me in the front bedroom, my brother down the hall. Sometime after midnight, the sound changed. I woke slowly, realizing the rain was still falling, but there was something else layered over it, a series of soft thumps spaced evenly apart. At first, I thought a tree branch might be scraping the roof in the wind, but as I listened, the pattern became clear. These were footsteps, slow, deliberate, crossing from one side of the roof to the other. I sat up, holding my breath. The steps stopped directly above my room, then moved again, circling toward the back of the house. A minute later, my brother's door creaked open. "You hear that?" he whispered. We grabbed a flashlight and the old ladder from the hall closet, thinking maybe an animal had gotten up there. We climbed into the attic, the boards groaning under our weight, but found nothing, just dust, old insulation, and the smell of dry wood. The sound had stopped by then, and we told ourselves it was probably the rain playing tricks on our ears, but around midnight it started again. This time, the steps were quicker, almost agitated. They crossed back and forth over the roof in uneven bursts, the tin ringing faintly with each impact. We stood in the hall listening, neither of us eager to go back up into the attic. Then, without warning, something heavy slid down the slope of the roof above the porch, the scrape loud enough to make my teeth ache. A dull thud followed, shaking the floorboards beneath us. We didn't open the door. Not then. We just stood there, looking at each other until the sound of the rain swallowed everything else. When morning came, we stepped outside. The porch was empty. No fallen branches, no sign of anything out of place, except for a set of wet footprints, bare feet, wide-set toes, the prints dark against the worn boards. They led from the edge of the porch into the yard, down, toward the tree line, and disappeared into the woods. We tried to brush it off. The rational explanation was someone messing with us, maybe kids from down the road, though the nearest neighbor was 3 miles away. Still, that night, I couldn't relax. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for the first hint of movement. It came just past 11. The steps were lighter at first, almost cautious, moving from the back of the house toward the front. Then they grew heavier, faster, until it sounded like whoever, or whatever, was up there was running. My brother and I met in the hallway, both of us pale, both gripping the handles of the fireplace pokers like we'd actually used them. The sliding sound came again, but this time it stopped halfway down the roof, as though the thing had caught itself. The rain had stopped hours ago, and the stillness outside made each noise sharper, more certain. We didn't sleep. By the third night, exhaustion had dulled my nerves. I fell asleep early, only to wake in the dark with the familiar sound above me. The footsteps were slower again, deliberate. They stopped for long stretches before moving a few paces more. It felt less like pacing and more like listening, like something was trying to place exactly where we were in the house. I rolled out of bed without turning on a light, crept to the front window and pulled the curtain back just an inch. Moonlight silvered the porch and the yard beyond. At first, I saw nothing. Then, from the corner of the roof, something shifted. A shape, low, crouched, moving with a strange, careful precision toward the peak. The outline was wrong for a person, but the sound of its steps was unmistakably human. I let the curtain fall and didn't look again. The next day, we debated leaving. The house could sit until we figured out what to do with it. But stubbornness kept us there. This was our family's place, and neither of us wanted to admit we were spooked enough to run. That night, the steps didn't come until after midnight. They were heavier than before, and each impact seemed to shudder through the walls. Then the sliding sound came again, but instead of ending in a thud on the porch, it kept going. Something scraped down the siding, slow and steady, like fingers dragging along the wood. My brother was the one who opened the front door. The night air rushed in, cold enough to sting my skin. The yard was empty. No movement in the trees, no sound except for the far-off rush of the creek. But on the porch, just at the edge of the boards, were fresh footprints. The same bare feet, toes splayed wide, each print glistening in the moonlight as if still wet. They led off into the grass, toward the woods. We followed them with the flashlight, our breath puffing white in the air. The prints stayed clear for maybe 30 yards before vanishing on the dry leaves. We stood there for a long moment, listening to the deep quiet of the forest. No wind, no insects. Just silence, thick and waiting. We turned back. The rest of the night passed without another sound, but in the morning, when I stepped onto the porch to fetch some tools, I froze. The footprints were back, not leading away this time, but toward the door. The trail ended at the threshold, the last print angled as though whoever made it had been standing there for a long while. We left that afternoon, packed the truck and didn't look back until the ridge curved enough to hide the house from view. That was years ago. The place never sold. It still sits there, empty, the tin roof catching the light on clear days. Sometimes, when I visit the area, I'll drive past the turnoff and think about taking the road up, just to see it again. But I never do, because I know that if I stood on that porch and listened, I'd hear it, the slow, deliberate steps crossing the roof, stopping just above my head. Story 6. The hollow behind the schoolhouse. The old schoolhouse sat on the edge of town like a forgotten tooth, weathered boards grey with age, windows clouded over with dust and spiderwebs. Everyone my age had been warned to stay away from it, though most of us thought the stories were just meant to keep kids from breaking their necks in a rotting building. But the one warning that always stuck was about the hollow behind it. A dip in the land where a narrow stream wound through a patch of tangled shade. The elders didn't say why, only that we were never to go there. I managed to follow that rule until I was 14, when a dare from a friend pushed me to break it. It was early summer, the air thick and humming with cicadas, and we'd been hanging around the empty playground in front of the schoolhouse, kicking gravel and talking about nothing. At some point, the conversation turned to the hollow. My friend, Jesse, said he'd gone halfway down once but got spooked and turned back. He grinned when he said it, and something in me felt challenged. The stream was easy to find. It trickled away from the edge of the playground, down a narrow slope into the trees. I followed it, the shade cooling the sweat on my skin, the air growing damp with the smell of wet earth. The further I went, the quieter it got. No insects, no birds, just the faint sound of water over stone. That's when I saw her. She was crouched at the stream's edge, her back to me, hands plunged into the water. At first I thought she was washing something, but then I saw her dip her head and drink straight from the stream, lips pressed to the surface like an animal. Her hair was matted and dark, streaked with something that caught the light. Her clothes, if you could call them that, were little more than rags clinging to her frame. I must have made a sound because she stopped. Slowly she turned her head toward me, and I froze. Her skin was cracked, deep lines splitting along her knuckles and the backs of her hands. The nails were blackened, thick and uneven, like they'd been worn down on stone. Her face was lean, the cheeks hollow, and her eyes fixed on me with a sharp, unblinking focus. Then she smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. Her lips peeled back to show teeth worn down to flat nubs, stained dark in places like she'd chewed something that never came clean. I couldn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't get up, just kept smiling, her head tilting the smallest bit to one side, as though she was memorizing me. The spell broke all at once. I turned and ran, branches whipping my arms as I scrambled back up the slope. I didn't stop until I reached the street, my lungs burning. Jesse laughed when he saw me, thinking I'd just spooked myself. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I didn't tell anyone. For the next few nights, I convinced myself it had been nothing more than some vagrant, maybe drunk or sick, who'd wandered into the hollow. But then, about a week later, I woke in the middle of the night to a sound outside my bedroom window. At first, it was faint, like the rustling of leaves. Then I heard it, someone whispering my name. The sound was so soft it could have been my imagination, but it came again, drawn out and almost careful. Eli. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. Eventually the whispering stopped, and I told myself it was the wind, or maybe a dream. But it happened again the next night, and the night after that. Always the same. My name, whispered slow and close, as if the speaker were leaning right up to the glass. I started sleeping with my light on, the curtains drawn tight, but that didn't help. The whispering would start around 2 in the morning, sometimes lasting only a few seconds, other times going on for what felt like minutes. There were no other sounds, no footsteps, no scratching, just my name, over and over. After a month of this, I began to dread nightfall. I'd lie in bed, tense, waiting for it. Sometimes I'd hear the faint sound of water dripping, though I had no idea where it was coming from. Once, I thought I smelled the damp, earthy scent of the hollow itself, as if the whole place had crept up under my window. One night in late August, I decided to look. I told myself I needed to see it, to prove to myself it was just my imagination. When the whispering started, I forced myself out of bed, heart pounding. I crept to the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see. At first, there was nothing but darkness. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw a figure standing in the yard. She was exactly as I remembered, crouched slightly, arms hanging loose at her sides, head tilted. Even from that distance, I could see the black of her nails, the pale stretch of her grin. I dropped the curtain and didn't look again. The next morning, I found wet footprints on the grass outside my window. Bare, narrow, toes splayed. The trail led toward the woods behind the house, but halfway there, the prints stopped. I stopped sleeping much after that. I kept the curtains pinned shut, my lights on, and stayed awake until dawn whenever I could. The whispering didn't come every night anymore, but when it did, it was closer, like she was testing how near she could get before I broke. One evening, Jesse came by and mentioned he'd been hearing things outside his house at night. He laughed it off, but there was a tightness in his voice I didn't miss. I wanted to tell him everything, but the words stuck in my throat. It felt like saying it out loud might make it worse. The last time I heard her was in the first week of September. It was just past midnight, and I'd been dozing with the lamp on. The whisper came, so close it was almost inside the room. My name, slow and deliberate, followed by the faintest scrape against the glass. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. And after a long pause, I heard the sound of bare feet walking away across the grass. I never saw her again, but even now, years later, if I wake in the deep quiet of the night, I'll lie still and listen, waiting to hear my name drift through the dark. I haven't been back to the hollow. I don't need to. I think a part of it followed me out, and it's been waiting ever since. Story 7. The porch light that never burned out. The neighborhood on the edge of town had been dying for years. It started slow, just a few houses going dark, families leaving for jobs in bigger cities. But by the time I moved into a rental there, most of the street was empty. Roofs caved in on some places, weeds growing high enough to swallow front porches whole. At night, the only sound was the wind pushing against loose siding, making a hollow, uneven thump. But there was one house that always stood out. It was an old 2-story with pale blue paint that had faded to the color of rainwater, peeling in strips along the siding. The yard was patchy and overgrown, but not in the wild, choking way the others were. The thing that caught your eye was the porch light, always on, every single night. I mean every night. Through rain, snow, wind, even the long summer blackouts we sometimes had out here, it glowed the same muted yellow. Folks in town said no one lived there. Some claimed an old woman had died in it years ago and the property never sold. Others said it was owned by some out-of-state guy who left it empty but kept the power on so squatters wouldn't move in. None of that explained why. Now and then, I'd see movement through the curtains. Just little shifts in the fabric when I walked past, like someone standing just behind them, watching the street. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, shadows from trees maybe. But one evening in late October, right before the clocks turned back, I was heading home from the store with a bag of groceries when I saw it. The porch light was burning, as always, and in the center of its weak halo sat someone in the rocking chair. They were still at first glance, but as I got closer I saw the faint forward and back motion, rocking slow, like they had nowhere else to be. The figure was lean, dressed in something loose and dark. Their head was tilted forward, chin almost to chest, so I couldn't see their face. My footsteps on the gravel seemed too loud in the quiet, so I raised a hand in a half wave, just to be polite. They didn't react. The rocking didn't slow or speed up. The head didn't lift. I passed the house and kept walking, glancing back once to see the chair still moving. The figure still bent forward, like they were studying the ground. The next day, I walked the same route. It was mid-afternoon, sunlight cutting sharp across the empty yards. When I passed the blue house, the porch was empty. The chair sat still, angled slightly toward the street as if it had been placed that way on purpose. It wasn't until I got home that I noticed the footprints. They led from the sidewalk to my porch. Bare feet, wide toes, the prints dark against the boards where mud had dried in little cracked ridges. They went up the 3 steps, stopped at my front door, and didn't turn back. I stood there with my grocery bag in one hand, staring down at them. The street behind me was empty. Even the wind was still. I scraped the mud away with the edge of my boot before going inside, but it didn't leave my mind all night. I told myself it was probably kids, though I hadn't seen any playing around here in months. Over the next week, I noticed more. The porch light never wavered, but sometimes when I passed, I swore it seemed brighter. The curtains would shift more than before, as if someone inside had just stepped back from them. Once, I thought I caught the faint outline of a face in the narrow gap between the panels, a pale shape in the dim interior. Then came the night I woke at 2:17 a.m. for no reason I could name. I lay there for a moment, disoriented before I heard it. The creak of a rocking chair, slow, deliberate, forward and back, forward and back. It wasn't in my house, but it was close enough that I could tell it was outside, somewhere in the cold night air. I got up and peered through my bedroom window. The street was empty, but I couldn't see the blue house from this side. The creaking went on for another minute, then stopped so abruptly it left the silence ringing in my ears. I didn't pass the house for a few days after that. Took the long way to the store, even though it added 20 minutes. But avoiding it didn't help. On the 3rd night, I woke again around 2 in the morning. This time there was no creaking, just the feeling of being watched. It was so strong I found myself holding my breath, listening for something I couldn't name. When I finally dared to look outside, I didn't see anyone. But the faint glow of a porch light far down the street cut through the dark like an eye half closed. The next time I walked past in daylight, the chair was empty again, but I noticed something new. The paint on the armrests was worn down to bare wood, not just from weather, but from use. Deep grooves like fingers had clutched there over and over. It was early December when I saw the figure again. The air had that brittle cold, where sound carries farther than it should. The porch light burned as always, but this time the figure was sitting straight, head tilted slightly toward me as I approached. The face was still shadowed, but I could feel the weight of their attention, as solid as a hand pressing against my chest. I didn't wave. I didn't speak. I kept walking, though every step felt like pushing against water. I didn't glance back. That night, the footprints returned. They started at the street, crossed my yard, and climbed the steps to my porch. This time, they were wet, glistening in the dim light from my kitchen window. They ended at the door, toes pointed toward the house, as if whoever left them had stood there for a long while. I stayed up until dawn, every light in the house on. No one knocked, no one tried the handle. But at some point, I heard it again, the slow, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair drifting on the cold air. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I walked to the blue house in broad daylight, climbed the steps, and knocked on the door. No answer. The porch boards groaned under my weight, the sound sharp in the stillness. I cupped my hands to the glass and peered inside. The curtains were thick and heavy, but just behind them I thought I saw movement, a shadow shifting, then gone. The air on that porch felt wrong, heavier somehow, and I left before I could think, twice. Winter deepened. The snow came heavy in January, muting everything in thick, white. I thought maybe the cold would put an end to it, but I was wrong. One morning, after a night of snowfall, I stepped outside to find a trail of bare footprints crossing my yard, The skin must have been pressed hard into the snow, because each print was sharp-edged, clear as if it had been made seconds before. They came from the direction of the blue house and ended at my bedroom window. That night, the power went out. I sat in the dark, staring at the faint yellow glow burning down the street, and in the silence, I heard the chair again, closer than ever, forward and back, forward and back. By morning, the prints in my yard were gone, hidden under a fresh layer of snow. But when I went to the door to fetch in the mail, I saw something on the inside of the wood, just above the handle, a smear of wet dirt, the faint outline of a hand. I've avoided that street since. But sometimes, if I'm up late and the night is still enough, I'll catch a glimpse of that light between the houses. And if I stand there too long, I start to think I can hear the slow, patient creak of the rocking chair, waiting for me to walk by again.